Welcome back to the program. It's December 5th, 2025, and we're going to be covering Sudan and some brief developments that have happened on the Sudan front, the civil war that's going on. There was a peace proposal that was presented to the two sides, and it was rejected by Sudan's military. We have to remember the current civil war that's going on right now is taking place between the Sudan's formal military and a group called RSF. It began in 2023 when the main army clashed with RSF, and RSF is a militia that's led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's former deputy. He's the leader of the army faction, and his former deputy, General Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, or Hemedti. So, if I botch these names, I apologize, but the army clashed with this militia led by a former deputy of the head of the army over plans to integrate their forces. Now, both men, and this was in 2023, and the militia was supposed to merge basically with the military, but these two, the leadership basically clashed, and then you have the civil war that broke out. Both men, Al-Burhan and we'll just call him Hamdan Daglo, a leader of RSF. Both were leaders of a 2019 counterinsurgency that ousted the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. 2 years later, Burhan and Daglo partnered to carry out a coup against the government of former Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok before the partnership broke down and war erupted. And that's just some brief background on what's happened, what led to the circumstances that we're seeing today. And so again, there was a peace proposal. Trump is looking to get this war wrapped up, and we'll get into some of those reasons why. Back in October, just to catch us up, the RSF, which is the militia unit, Daglo's unit, captured Al-Fashir city, and this is in southwestern Sudan in Darfur, which has been under siege for 18 months. It was also the last Sudanese military stronghold in the Darfur region. And so that was a powerful military stronghold. It had been under siege for quite some time, and the RSF militia finally took it. And this led to widespread war crimes. It's been something that we've seen an uptick in reporting over the past couple of months. War crimes, mass killings, a lot of this stuff is caught on footage. There was actually even a report that I read that said that there had been so many civilians that had been killed that in certain areas of that particular city, satellite imagery could see blood on the ground in some of these areas. So that's how intense the killings, and we'll just call it the mass killings and war crimes that have taken place. That's how intense they've been. So the RSF, of course, continues to, they deny these war crimes are happening. They're, maintaining that they're going after the military that's still holed up in the city. So the portion who did manage to escape the city ended up going over to Chad, the neighboring country, Chad. And there's obviously, a significant amount of refugees that have been pouring into Chad from Sudan for quite some time. Their resources are fairly restricted, and so it's been a humanitarian crisis. It's only getting worse. As a humanitarian crisis on a scale that we look at these other crises that we oftentimes are paying attention to, particularly in the Middle East with Israel, and we don't even consider the gravity and scope of this one that's going on. Probably because a lot of people will probably say, well, African countries they're always at war with each other, but it is important to recognize just the scale of how brutal this is, and how I would say it's a positive that Trump is wanting to stop this violence from happening, this war, this civil war. I would argue that the motive that he has for wanting to do it isn't appropriate, probably not moral, but we'll go on here with some of these notes. This month, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he plans to put greater attention and pressure on helping to find an end to the civil war in Sudan. After being urged to take action by Saudi Crown Prince MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, during his visit to the White House. So it was about 2 weeks ago, MBS came to the White House, and this is one of the issues that they were discussing, and that's ending the war in Sudan. You have to remember, before the outbreak of the war, Sudan was a signatory of the Abrahamic Accords. And so this kind of all ties in. You know, MBS wants very much to be a part, to see a revamp and follow through on the Abraham Accords that Trump had initiated during his first term. And remember, those accords involved Sudan and several Middle Eastern countries in normalizing relationships, their relationship, in the normalization of their relationship with Israel. So Sudan was a signatory of the Abraham Accords. So I believe that given this larger strategy of looking to, you know, re-engage and follow through and see the completion of the Abraham Accords, Trump obviously needs this civil war to tamp down and to stop, right? And even if it did, the problem with the reintroduction of the Abrahamic Accords and bringing, you know, and ensuring that Sudan is a reliable partner in that, you have to have a reliable government, right? And so the civil war may end, but then it's a matter of trying to figure out what is the interim government going to compose of? What's that going to look like? So this is one of the reasons the Abraham Accords, essentially in a nutshell, is what I'm saying, that's one of the reasons why Trump is looking to try to, tamp down the civil war and to bring it to an end. And he's prioritizing Sudan. Now, will he do this with a mind to stop? Again, this is the question that I've asked. Will he do this with the mind to stop mass murder, the starvation, population displacement, the mass rapes, all of these things, or to move the carnage quietly to the side, right? Because it's a liability. If he's focusing solely on this economic proposal, normalizing relations with between Israel and these countries, if he's focused solely on that, and Sudan also has rare earths and minerals, particularly gold. If he's focused on that kind of thing and he's just completely setting to the side all of the atrocities that have been going on over there, it sounds like something that he would do, unfortunately, but those are the questions we have to ask. Is that why? Is he going to truly deal with root causes and, again, the humanitarian crisis that's going on over there before worrying about the Abrahamic Accords? Probably not. But we'll see. The U.S. has been working with the Quad. This is Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates on ways to end the war. They've been working on this for months, and they procured a peace proposal at the beginning of the month. And I believe that was, I don't have the specific month, I didn't put that down. I think it was November. I believe it was November that they procured this peace proposal. It has been since rejected by the army, Burhan. And it called basically for a 3-month humanitarian truce followed by a 9-month political process. Now, again, I'll be probably repeating this a couple times in this video, but it's something that I often will complain about. It seems like he wants a ceasefire without dealing with root causes in this, right? A 3-month humanitarian truce. This would, of course, would allow both sides to rearm if something should break apart, which in a highly volatile region like this, it's very likely to happen. We'll get to that in a moment when we briefly touch on what's been happening with Congo and Rwanda. But a 3-month humanitarian truce followed by a 9-month political process, right? And it's so broad and vague that, what's the political process look like? Are there ideas for how that would take place? And I would agree. It would be nice to see a truce take place, but a truce taking place would have to happen under the umbrella of a larger understanding when it comes down to, a political process. A political process needs to be spelled out very specifically before you can have a truce. It doesn't necessarily need to get into the technicalities of how a political process is going to evolve, but there needs to be some kind of framework before the truce, the humanitarian pause. Otherwise, both sides won't be able to trust each other, right? And I don't think that the negotiations are going to go on, probably, but the fighting will continue. So, so the RSF agreed. Daglo and his militia agreed after taking al-Fashir. You know, they're probably finding themselves in a good position. They probably can't get too much further. They probably can't make much further progress where they're at right now. And plus, you've got, again, international attention on potential war crimes in al-Fashir, right? And so they're jumping at the opportunity. Sudan's military a couple of days ago rejected the proposal. And again, this has happened in November because it doesn't require the RSF militia to be disbanded and disarmed. And so this is part of like the politicization process. What do we see? What's the vision for the disarmament, or what's the vision for the militia, right? What's the vision for the army? Are they going to work together? Or is the militia going to be absorbed into the army? This is part of the political process that we would at least need to see a framework for before any ceasefire took place. And I would say, when I say we, I'm actually saying both sides would need to see that, particularly the side of the army would need to see, you know, what's this political process going to look like between us and the RSF, the militia? What's the relationship going to look like? And so the RSF accepted it, this vague deal. The army said, you know, well, you know, are they going to be disarmed? Are they going to be disbanded? That needs to happen. How are we going to do that? Is it, you know, there's a lot of questions basically that Al-Burham is asking. And of course, again, I'm going to get into this pattern that we see in all these peace proposals. Freeze the conflict and then negotiate. Freeze the conflict, then get into the political process. Well, I would just say, again, the political process needs to be sketched out first before the ceasefire would be accepted by either side. Then look at other ways then we look at the other way when hostilities continue, albeit at a slow tempo, right? It's like, even if you manage to get the ceasefires, we talked about in another video, the hostilities are still happening. They're still happening at a very small tempo, but they're out of sight. They're out of the sight of the international media. And this would be chalked up as a victory by the administration, which it's not. And when we take, again, a look at the scope of the tragedy and atrocities that are happening in Sudan right now, it's not something that should just be swept under the rug and so that we could prioritize some kind of, you know, economic deal between, you know, Saudi Arabia and the Middle East countries and Sudan and Israel. So this is a quote from the Foreign Policy magazine with Charlotte Slente, the Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, and it just popped out to me. It's an article that popped out to me. It's a quote from an article that popped out to me a couple of days ago, and it kind of, you know, ties into what we're talking about right now. She said, and let's remember that humanitarian assistance is only dealing with the consequences of conflict and not really addressing the root causes. The fact that we have only had action on managing consequences and not preventing them has actually made the crisis become much worse. And that's such a crucial thing to understand, right? Again, I'll just reiterate. We're dealing with the consequences, whether it's the war between Israel and Gaza, Ukraine and Russia, this one in Sudan, the issue that's going on between Congo and Rwanda. All of these situations the Trump administration is looking to resolve and basically manage consequences. One of the things that you'll always hear him say is that, well, I was just given this, these things would have never happened if I'd have been president, if I'd have been elected president in 2020. And so he's dealing with consequences, basically. He just wants all that stuff to stop, the consequences of the war. And we're seeing more and more as the developments with these attempted ceasefires, the attempted proposals with Russia and Ukraine. They're not, and I've said it many times in these videos, they're not looking to address root causes. Because if you address root causes, you're going to be negotiating with many of these countries indefinitely. And unfortunately, Trump just doesn't have the political capital to do it, and I don't think that he's got the political acumen to do it either. Now, this is an important perspective. Trump consistently talks about ceasefires and, stopping the dying from taking place in the various conflict zones that we just mentioned, and the consequences of deeper, and these are consequences of deeper issues, right? And it's kind of like what we were just saying. Deeper issues, deeper root causes that need to be addressed. And the UAE's involvement in these negotiations are also problematic. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are as part of the Quad, and they've been accused on several occasions of arming the RSF, the militia in Sudan, which they've denied. There's a little bit on that. It says the UAE has allegedly supported the RSF in an effort to control Sudan's gold and wheat production, as well as establish access to its strategic ports on the Red Sea, which are crucial in its rivalry with Saudi Arabia. And we're going to get into those ports in a moment in another story. But the UAE is widely accused by rights groups of arming the paramilitaries. The AP reported earlier this month that U.S. intelligence assessments for many months have found that the Emiratis, a close ally, U.S. ally, has been sending weapons to the RSF. Now, I have no reason to doubt that that's taking place, and it's really sad and it's disgusting if that's happening because we do provide military aid to the United Arab Emirates, and if that war material, if the armaments are ending up in the hands of the militia that's carrying out these mass murders and very likely war crimes, it's just terrible and disgusting. Right? So this is disgusting us sending this an infinite amount of aid to Israel to slaughter a bunch of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, right? So, again, UAE is an ally, and they're receiving foreign aid and military aid. So it's difficult to predict how all this will unfold. And I think that given the larger context relative to the Abrahamic Accords, there will be more serious effort to resolve this conflict likely next year. Now, it's going to be difficult for Trump to focus on doing that because next year's midterm, so it's going to be likely we're going to see a pivot to the domestic front, the economy, and these kinds of things. And so, will there be a resolution to this next year? Possibly, but it's very likely that even if there is one, it would be a very tenuous ceasefire. And but I think that the effort will likely be more sustained than, say, for example, Congo and Rwanda, which we'll get into in a moment. And that's an issue that Trump really hasn't resolved yet. We're going to look at that peace proposal that was just recently signed a couple of days ago between Rwanda and Congo, but that peace proposal doesn't necessarily address the core issue that earlier this year, which was the allegedly Rwandan-backed M23 group that's supposedly defending the Tutsi minority in the eastern part of Congo. And we went over some of that history. You could check out a video that I did on that a couple months ago. But that wasn't he didn't resolve anything in terms of that. He's looking to again access their minerals and resources, right? Congo and Rwanda are not formally at war, so M23 wasn't part of those discussions in that peace proposal. So that's why I say that. But I'm going off topic. As we were saying here earlier. We have to consider what's mixed into these circumstances as well. Their interests to build a naval base in Sudan. The military, and we're going to get into that naval base situation in a moment because the leader of Sudan's military, al-Burhan, has actually extended the offer to Russia to build a naval base off of their coast. And so we'll be diving into that in a moment. But, going back to what we were talking about, the military has extended an offer to do this, perhaps. when we look, when we look actually at, I want to go just briefly back to the Russia situation. And when we look at the military extending this offer to the Russians, this is also likely part of the strategy that Trump is looking at. This is likely one of the reasons that Trump is looking to resolve this conflict before, there's any kind of extended involvement with the Russians. I don't think that right now there would be, considering that they're still, at war with Ukraine. But I'm sure that Trump is being encouraged by personnel within his administration that he does need to make sure that he keeps his eye on that. Also, I would say that it's probably, the idea of Al-Burham extending this olive branch to. I know I said I was going to talk about this later, but I kind of, I'm kind of on the topic. The idea of the leader of their military saying, well, the Russians can come and build their base here. This may be just some leverage that he's trying to build up so that the U.S. and the Quad can take his demands seriously. Since he's the one that had a problem with the peace proposal initially, they're probably using this olive branch they're extending to the Russians as a way of just kind of, forcing the Americans to pay attention to some of the demands that they have and the requirements they would have to have if they were going to initiate the ceasefire between them and the militia. And like I said, the Russians have plenty on their plate. Even if they agreed to this, it would probably just complicate, their diplomatic efforts with the U.S. or the U.S.'s diplomatic efforts with them. And the project likely wouldn't materialize for, decades. And given the complexity of the civil war that's going on in Sudan right now, I guess we're just kind of touching on this situation with the Russian port right now, the naval port. The naval base. Given the complexity that the Civil War is introduced, it would seem like something that they could put on the back burner. The Russians could put this on the back burner because, they had a naval base like this in Syria. And Syria had, a civil war. And when Syria was overrun by, Turkish and U.S.-backed forces, ISIS forces, basically, the Russians had a port there. And it was in jeopardy for quite some time. I believe that the Russians were able to negotiate an understanding about their port that they had in Syria, but is either a port or a naval base. But, they were able to negotiate an understanding with the newly formed, ISIS-backed Syrian government. They were able to get past that and maintain their base there. So I think that given all the trouble that they've had in doing that in Syria, it would seem even less likely that they would try to do something like that, at least right now in Sudan with the civil war going on. So it's kind of a useless offer, but I think that Al-Burham, the leader of the military, is just basically looking to, create some kind of anxiety or leverage so that, the Quad and the U.S. can listen to some of the demands whenever they're procuring another peace proposal. So even if there is a temporary reprieve in hostilities, and an interim government is installed in Sudan, like I said, it could turn out to be Syria all over again. And I'm kind of, going backwards here, but we're going to get into the article, digging a little bit deeper into the naval base that Sudan has offered Russia. So the article starts out by saying, quote, Sudan's military government has offered Russia what would be its first naval base in Africa, an unprecedented perch overlooking the critical Red Sea trade routes, according to Sudanese officials. The deal, if it happens, would be a strategic advantage for Moscow, which has struggled to deepen its foothold on the continent. If you remember, they've used the Wagner Group and various militias to try to gain a foothold in Africa over the past I would say several years, and they've been remotely successful, but nothing too notable right now from a strategic standpoint. It will be a troubling development for the U.S., which has sought to keep Russia and China from controlling African ports, where they could rearm and refit warships and potentially choke off vital sea lanes. Under a 25-year plan, Sudan's military government presented to Russian officials in October, Moscow would have the right to station up to 300 troops and dock as many as 4 warships, including nuclear-powered ones, at Port Sudan or another yet-to-be-named Red Sea facility, the official said. And again, the lack of stability in the country would just kind of, this is political. That's how we would look at something like this. It's a political proposal that Alburnham is using again to influence the negotiations related to the Civil War. The Kremlin also would get the inside track on lucrative mining concessions in Sudan, the third largest gold producer in Africa. Now, again, I'm sure Trump's ears perked up whenever he heard this, and there's just no way that the Russians are going to get access to that anytime soon, right? This is one of the main drivers in Trump's administration right now. In terms of national security, it's, securing natural resources for the country, which is an initiative that I actually like that he has. I don't necessarily like the ways that he's going about doing it, but I'm just saying it is ideally a good thing. Try to become independent in terms of our procurement of rare earths and this kind of thing. Now, the article continues, from Port Sudan, Moscow would be well placed to monitor maritime traffic and to and from the Suez Canal, the shortcut between Europe and Asia that carries about 12% of global trade. In exchange for allowing Russian forces the long-term use of its territory, the Sudanese officials said the country's beleaguered military regime would get advanced military Russian anti-aircraft systems and other weaponry at preferential prices as it pursues the civil war with the rebel forces. Now, it's interesting that they actually, and I forgot this part of the article, they actually want this to go into effect as the civil war is going on, right? And what's interesting is I've been following this war for a while. The Russians have actually supplied both sides, right? There's documentation that the Russians have actually kind of been on both sides of this civil war. At one point, they were supporting the RSF. I'm not going to say military hardware, but in some form or another, there was support for the RSF, and now it's pivoted to the military. And so, very interesting developments. I think that this is, kind of how these wars, the nature of these wars in the Middle East, in Africa. So they're looking to use the Russian military hardware to help them defeat the RSF. So it's kind of interesting. They wouldn't really get anything in return right now, since they can't build a port right now during the Civil War. So it'd really be kind of beneficial. If we can take this seriously, it would really be beneficial for their military more so than anything else. So the Sudanese military official told the Wall Street Journal that Sudan needs new weapons, but that doing a deal with Russia might cause problem with the U.S., obviously, and the European Union. The Sudanese government and armed forces didn't respond to requests for comment. The prospect of a Russian base on the Red Sea alarms U.S. security officials who have been jockeying with Beijing and Moscow for years over military aspirations in Africa. Russian naval activities are limited by the lack of warm water ports where ships can resupply or undergo repairs. So at present, you've got that situation, and you still have a lot of Russian mercenaries all around Africa, looking, like we said earlier, to gain a foothold. Now, this deal making, it comes as Moscow has lost some of its initiative in Africa a couple of years ago. Countries such as Mali and the Central African Republic were hiring mercenaries from the Wagner Group, and that has since basically ceased. And we know what happened when consider, sure, if you're listening to the show, you understand that the Wagner Group basically has been dispersed and absorbed into the Russian military for the most part, and that's largely because their chief, Evgeny Prigozhin, the charismatic leader of the Wagner Group, tried to allegedly lead a coup against President Putin last year, I believe it was. The war has been going on between Russia and Ukraine for such a long time, but I believe it was last year that he tried to lead a coup against Putin after they took the strategic city of Artyomovsk, formerly known as Bakhmut. And I just want to wrap up by touching on Congo and Rwanda quickly, since this is something that we covered earlier a few months ago. There have been, like we talked about earlier, a few developments. Of course, earlier this year, M23, this allegedly Rwandan-backed militia, seized two large cities in eastern Congo earlier this year, raising fears of a wider war. The war has not really expanded beyond the eastern part of Congo, so it's basically contained in the Kivus. Analysts say U.S. diplomacy has paused the escalation of fighting, but has failed to resolve the core issues. That's what we've talked about earlier. The deals are driven more by the scramble for minerals than by a genuine effort to end the bloodshed. We have to remember something about this conflict. It's been going on between Rwanda and Congo since like 30 years, right? It's kind of a bold statement for Trump to just jump up and say, you know what, I resolved a conflict that one goes back to the genocide in '94, in Rwanda. And I just say, what a bold, foolish statement to make. But this is the way he looks at it. And so it is driven by the minerals. Again, as I said earlier, Trump's drive to get strategic rare earths and minerals and this kind of thing, it's not something I'm against. I'm against the way that he's doing it. If you have Greenland, you can still try to see if you could achieve something in Congo and Rwanda, but it's just not going to be something, it's not going to be sustainable, right? A cursory glance at the history between those two countries will tell you that. Because again, we have to understand something about it, and it's that it's not necessarily, state against state. It's militias. There are like, 10 scores of militias that operate in the eastern part of Congo that run the rare earths and minerals trades, right? Now, in some of them, I'm sure they do it at the behest of their respective governments, but you have militias that are sponsored by Uganda, Rwanda, Congo, many of the neighboring African countries. And so when you're talking about bringing peace between the two countries, I think that's easy. I'm sure that Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame, they'll sit and sign whatever you need them to sign. But, if their militias aren't there signing on to these deals, what are you going to do about it? So M23, this is the militia that's allegedly backed by Rwanda, says it's fighting to protect ethnic Tutsi communities in eastern Congo, right? Minority Tutsi community in eastern Congo. Plenty of Hutus, and remember the Hutus were the ones that were driven out of Congo after the genocide in 1994. The Hutus were driven out of Rwanda after the genocide in 1994 into eastern Congo, right? So many of those Hutus are the ones I forget what the word is. I think it's pronounced genocidaires or something like that. Many of them were the ones that were carrying out the homicide against the Tutsis. They're in eastern Congo right now. And this group, M23, there's also a minority of Tutsi in the eastern Congo. And this group is claiming that they're protecting that ethnic minority, just to kind of give a little background. Again, two devastating wars in the African Great Lakes region between 1996 and 2003, between basically Rwanda and Congo, cost millions of lives. The latest cycle of fighting has killed thousands of people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Trump aides are looking to facilitate billions of dollars of Western investment in the region, rich in tantalum, tin, tungsten, gold, cobalt, copper, lithium, and other minerals. Likely a project that will never make it off the ground. And again, as we're going to, briefly touch on in this article here, the fighting is on and off, right? There was a ceasefire a while back that was announced. The ceasefire has been broken several times, and M23 has not signed on any deal. They're mediating. Qatar is mediating negotiations with M23 and Congo and Rwanda. So that really hasn't been too fruitful so far. But this is just the story about the Trump-backed peace deal between Congo and Rwanda. It is from Reuters, I believe. U.S. President Donald Trump gathered leaders of the DRC and Rwanda to sign a peace deal in Washington on Thursday, even as fighting continued in the war-scarred region. Rwandan President Paul Kagame and Democratic Republic of Congo President Felix Tshisekedi affirmed commitments to an economic integration compact last month. So this is an economic agreement, right? Has very little to do with fighting. And a U.S. brokered peace deal reached in June. They were also due to sign an agreement on critical minerals. The signing handed Trump the latest in a series of made-for-television diplomatic victories, which is what they are, right? So the best way to put it. In this case, one at odds with the bloody situation on the ground. Washington wants access to the spectrum of natural resources in Congo and is scrambling globally to counter China's dominance in the critical minerals. And I've said this before about this situation. obtaining these rare earths in these regions where Trump is seeking them out, these troublesome hotspot regions, it would take, you understand that when you read about China excavating and doing these projects in Africa and these kinds of things, it's a very dirty business, right? These are like, they're war-torn areas. There's a lot of corruption that's going on, a lot of corruption coming from, the Chinese side, the African governments that they're dealing with. And then, of course, like we talked about earlier, they're dealing with militias. It's a dirty business, right? And I don't think, Trump may know Eric Prince and some of these, what do they call them? The military contractors and stuff like that could operate in Congo. That's kind of what he's wanting to use Eric Prince and his team for. He may know some groups like this that can operate in this area, but it's just a dirty business. And you have to ask yourself, is there going to be like a noticeable return on any of this stuff, right? Let's see. Trump says we are settling a war that's been going on for decades. Again, just a very presumptuous thing to say. If it was something you want to do in good faith, then that's something different. But if it's just for the rare earths, they're probably going to enrich, again, some military contractors, some businesses in the U.S., and him and his family. That's just something that's just totally ridiculous, sad and sick. They're spending a lot of time killing each other, and now they're going to spend a lot of time hugging, holding hands, and taking advantage of the United States of America economically, like every other country does. As leaders signed, clashes between Rwanda-backed M23 rebels and Congolese army were reported throughout South Kivu province. A spokesperson for M23 accused the government troops of bombing several civilian areas. The peace agreement may not change the humanitarian crisis on the ground. Congo's army and M23 accused each other of violating existing ceasefire agreements. It's going to be the case for a long time, right? At a news conference in Washington on Wednesday, Congolese official Pak Muyaya blamed M23 for recent fighting and said it was proof that Rwanda doesn't want peace. M23 did not attend the meeting in Washington. It is not bound by the terms of the Congo-Rwanda agreement, which, again, this is supposed to be something that brings peace. M23 is one of the fighting entities there. And I'm assuming that, Trump is assuming that Paul Kagame of Rwanda is saying, well, he's going to stop them from doing what they're doing. I don't think that, even if they're getting some kind of financing or something like this from Kagame's government, we'd have no idea what the scope is of his control over this group if he has it at all, right? It's not too far-fetched to think that they are operating with impunity on their own, given the history of some of the wars that we've seen that I've read about over there. Rwanda denies, of course, we're back in M23. Kigali has said its own forces have acted in defense against ethnic Hutu militiamen linked to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, when more than 1 million people were killed. Under the Trump-backed agreement, Congo would need to crack down on the armed group opposed to M23, Democratic Forces of the Liberation of Rwanda. Rwanda needed to withdraw its forces from Congo. Little apparent progress has been made on either side since June. Kagame says, and this is where we're going to close out with, because again, it goes to the crux of what I say in basically every video that I talk about foreign policy. We have seen countless mediations and efforts, but none has succeeded in resolving the underlying issues, the core issues, the root causes, right? President Trump introduced a new and effective dynamism that created the space for breakthroughs. Tshisekedi called the deal a turning point. So that is Sudan in their civil war, in a civil war update with Sudan, and that is the so-called peace agreement between Rwanda and Congo. And we're going to be monitoring what's happening in terms of the situation with M23, if the fighting will ever stop, or if they're just going to continue fighting and taking more of Congo. We shall see. If anything, it's likely that it would take a multi-coalition effort to push back M23. In a war like this, Congo's military is not as, I would say, skilled and potentially advanced as Rwanda. Rwanda is a very skilled and nimble, experienced military. So it would likely take a group effort to push M23 back, if they are, in fact, completely bankrolled and armed by Rwanda. But we'll see how this unfolds and unpacks. And so thanks for joining me. If you like the video, like the video, subscribe to the channel. And again, thanks for joining.